I'm going to talk about the politics of STEM shortage claims. So first, let me just say what I mean by a STEM shortage claim. STEM is an acronym which stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. It's been around for a long time, but it came into widespread use in the early 2000s in the context of a number of political and public policy issues. So those include education, they include employment, they include immigration, they include a number of other topics that I'll get into in this presentation. A STEM shortage claim is a claim usually that there's a desperate or severe shortage of STEM workers, so scientists, engineers, mathematicians, and very frequently the last few years, computer scientists, software engineers, programmers. There are several different terms that are often used interchangeably for computer scientists, software engineers, and programmers. So in the last couple of years, it's really focused on computer science and software engineering. STEM shortage claims are very old. They've been made all the way back to the 1950s, to the Cold War, to the time of Sputnik. They've moved over the years as to specifically which areas tend to get emphasized. In the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of the emphasis was on physics and aerospace, rocketry, basically fields related to the Cold War, which were employing large numbers of scientists and engineers to work for various companies and government agencies, entities like the Department of Defense, NASA, companies like Lockheed. So STEM shortage claims are not new. They're perpetual. You hear them every year. You hear them during severe downturns when the news will have reports of hundreds of thousands of engineers being laid off, and yet you will hear STEM shortage claims. They are surprisingly pervasive, and they are surprisingly widely repeated. The remarkable thing is they're largely not true. And this can be demonstrated by looking closely at a variety of data sources and information. There's many sort of common sense indications, just the large numbers of layoffs of engineers and scientists that take place every year. These all show that there isn't really a substantial shortage of STEM workers in the United States. There wasn't actually back in the 1950s and 60s either. It's just a perpetual claim. So it's very remarkable that it's made so persistently by so many people and largely repeated uncritically by the major media, by what sometimes is called the mainstream media. Typically, where a media organization is heavily funded by corporate advertising, you'll find that these things appear in opinion pieces, editorials, news articles, despite the fact that the situation on the ground is that there really isn't a shortage. So I've given more of an introduction to the shortage claims in an earlier video, which I'll include a link below. And if you're not very familiar with the issues, you should probably start with that video. I want to go beyond and talk about the politics of STEM shortage claims. Because STEM shortage claims are intertwined with a surprising range of issues, and they play a very substantial role in the discussion of certain issues. These include education policy and education. They include immigration policies and programs. They include issues about race and diversity and so on. They have to get tangled up in those. It also raises some questions about the independence and freedom of the press. It raises, it involves the issue of age discrimination. We'll see as I talk about it a little bit that there's a lot of emphasis in discussions of STEM fields of discrimination based on race or sex. There's a lot of evidence that there's very heavy, quote, discrimination. I'll talk about this a little bit against older people. And older actually means people who look over the age of 35, even 30 sometimes. It's kind of like the old movie and science fiction story, Logan's Run, where people are all eliminated by the government at the age of 30. Now, that's not totally true. There are, of course, people over 35 who have STEM jobs and careers and so on. But there's a marked drop-off in the 30s. It's very well documented in many studies of age distribution at various companies and employers. But that is often not talked about very much compared to issues about underrepresented minorities and women, for example. I'm going to talk about all of these and some other issues as well that tie into the politics. So first, let's talk a little bit about how STEM shortage claims are intertwined with education issues. So typically the explanation that's either explicitly stated or implied for why the United States, a country with 330 million people, supposedly has a shortage of STEM workers is the finger is pointed at education. Our education, particularly on STEM subjects of science, math, increasingly computer science education, the problem is the teaching. And in fact, if you look at how it's frequently presented in the mainstream media, and in various political discussions, the focus is typically made on public schools and on schools between the kindergarten and 12th grade, senior high school level. Remarkably, there's very little criticism of the teaching of STEM subjects in colleges and universities and the more advanced level. It's somewhat curious because the companies actually hire not from high schools. They hire college graduates and postgraduates, people with advanced degrees like master's and Ph.D. degrees. Mostly they hire people from college level, bachelor's degree holders. And they're dissatisfied with what they're getting from these colleges. At least that's what they seem to be saying, right? That's who they. But instead of pointing the finger at the quality of STEM education at the college level, it's always pointed, or almost always pointed, at the K through 12 level. And that's one of the curiosities. It's also typically focused on public schools rather than private schools. There's a remarkable overlap with the charter school movement, various kinds of things that now are being called education reform. So, for example, many high-tech employers are mixed up in these reform movements. So Bill Gates, for example, is very famous for the Common Core, for promoting the Common Core education program, and that is a program for K through 12. It's not a college. He's not trying to improve college education. The Gates Foundation has given literally billions of dollars to various of these, purported education reform activities. Laurene Powell Jobs, the widow of Steve Jobs, the Apple founder, and so on, has been very involved in these kind of activities. Facebook has, for example, they famously gave $100 million to the school system in Newark, New Jersey, a very poor school system. They've been involved in a number of these education activities. And so many of these companies, both institutionally, through either directly from the company or from a corporate foundation, or individually by the people who own the companies or CEOs, people like Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates, have been very heavily involved in this activity, and it overlaps substantially with the STEM shortage claim. So often the reason they're supposedly so concerned is what they seem to be saying is, hey, the problem that we have here is really bad schools, and they're pointing the finger typically at schools like the schools in Washington, D.C., inner city schools, Newark, New Jersey, other inner city schools that generally are heavily black or Hispanic students, or they're sometimes, this is less common, but sometimes they will also bring in rural schools like Appalachia, Kentucky, where the students tend to be poor whites. But really, overwhelmingly, the focus is on minority, what are typically being called underrepresented minorities today, which is really a kind of a code word for black or African American and Hispanic. And in fact, even within Hispanic, it really seems to be a code word for Hispanics who have visible American Indian ancestry. So part of the reason here is that one of the things that high-tech companies, particularly in the Silicon Valley, this is less true of like government contractors in the Washington, D.C. area, but in the Silicon Valley, under pressure, these companies disclose information about who they hire, who they employ, and those reports will show typically about 20% women, 80% men. They claim that they have about, I would say around 40% what they call Asian, around 60% white, and very small numbers of Hispanics, maybe 4 or 5% Hispanics, and 1 or 2% blacks. They don't disclose, the vast majority of these companies have still refused to disclose the age and experience level of their employees. So they focus your attention on certain groups and certain issues by doing this. So they stay away from the issue of how old the people are in their companies. Now, various groups, job search firms, other types of entities separate from these companies have put out actually surveys of age, and they usually will show that these companies are very young. That most of the people are in their 20s, maybe early 30s. The median age will be something like 29 or something, numbers like that. 30, I think it's 32 or something for Apple. Again, the exact numbers, I'll provide some links to studies and surveys with this video. The point is that people are very young, but again, your attention is often not focused on that. There's a lot more attention focused on issues to do with sex and race relative to age. And it's interesting to note that age affects everybody, whether you're white or you're black or you're brown or you're purple polka dot or you're Asian, which makes up a large fraction of the actual labor force in the STEM fields. It affects everybody. All of these groups seem to get pushed out as they get into their 30s or pressured out. Something happens to them. in their 30s. But the focus of an enormous amount of the attention that you'll see with the STEM shortage claims, tied in with the STEM shortage claims, is that we're talking is not about the age issues or experience issues. It's about, again, it's about race or sex. And that ties in with education issues, because what they seem to be saying is, well, hey, if these schools were producing black or brown graduates who are up to basic competency even, we would hire them because we're desperate, right? We're struggling here. It's a crisis. The country is going to be overwhelmed if we don't get more STEM workers. And it's often portrayed in this very crisis way, and that invoking patriotism, that we're going to fall behind other countries that are enemies abroad, terrorists or Russia or China or something like that, are going to beat us because we're falling behind them in STEM workers. So it's this complicated, tangled web. So education is one of the areas which gets intertwined with STEM shortage. Now keep in mind, these things can be logically separated. We could have great education in the United States, and it's just not producing enough people. The issue isn't that the education is poor, it's just there are not enough people. Right? These could be separate, but it's never presented that way. Rather, the explanation that's frequently implied or explicitly stated is, oh, well, the schools are so terrible. Again, they're talking about K through 12. They're very rarely criticizing universities that they're hiring people from. So they seem to be saying, hey, somehow universities aren't at fault. It's that they're just not getting enough people into the universities and colleges from the high schools. So the STEM shortage claims are, in fact, stapled together with claims that the United States has relatively poor STEM education. And these are often tied in with pointing to the results of international studies or tests. There's two. There's PISA and there's, I'm not sure if I remember the acronym for the other ones, but they typically point at these tests, which often show the U.S. is kind of average. We're not really bad, but we're not at the level that shows up for countries like Finland, for example, or what are basically like city-states like Hong Kong or Singapore, for example. Asian city-states make up several of the better performing according to these tests. Now, there's a lot of questions about these tests, who actually competes in them, what they're actually showing. Comparing student populations in different countries is a complicated issue. The different countries have different educational systems, so when you are trying to say this is an 8th grader in the US versus a supposed 8th grader in Hong Kong, it's not always as clear as it might sound. But let's just ignore that. They tend to show the US is sort of in the average. Of course, averages can be very misleading. For one reason, in the United States, the high-tech companies are usually taking the top few percent of students. And so that can be very unclear how that relates to the average in the United States, because there's wide variation in the quality of schools in different parts of the country, in different areas, like Washington, D.C., for example, has pretty poor results, at least from their schools. So again, one of the things that STEM shortage is tied in with is education, and another is immigration policies. So in this context, what's typically said is that typically the people promoting the STEM shortage claims are also promoting guest worker programs, or you can call it almost a system of indentured servitude. So there are visas like the H-1B visa, which is the most famous and the most controversial, but there's actually a number of these visa programs, the OPT program, L-1 visa, there's several of them. It's hard to keep track of them. Remarkably, it's hard to get very clear information about these visas, how many people have them, what actually happens to the people who have these visas. But these visas allow companies to bring people to the United States temporarily. They are, for example, the H-1B is considered a non-immigrant visa. So these are not immigrants. They're guest workers who are brought here to the United States. They have to be sponsored by an employer. It's difficult for them to switch from one employer to another. They're usually attracted to the United States because the employers can also sponsor them for a U.S. citizenship or a green card, the permanent residency. So typically you get the permanent residency first and then you become a U.S. citizen. It's not really clear, and nobody seems to be able to find very good numbers on this, what percentage of these people actually get the green cards, what percentage actually become U.S. citizens. It's undoubtedly substantial. In the Silicon Valley, there are entire neighborhoods in Cupertino, for example, that are over 90% South Asian. They're very wealthy neighborhoods. So certainly there's a significant number of people immigrating here from South Asia, for example, from China or Chinese-speaking countries, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and there are Chinese-speaking minorities in a number of other countries. So there's no question there's people who do come here on these various visa programs and do eventually get U.S. citizenship. But many of them don't seem to get U.S. citizenship. They seem to go back home or something happens to them. But the justification for these visa programs is something like this, very frequent, has been for over 20 years. The H-1B visa program dates back to 1989. It's the big one. It's still the big one of these programs. Typically what they will say is something like, oh my God, there's this shortage of STEM workers. We're going to go out of business. Somebody overseas is going to crush the United States if we don't get STEM workers. They supposedly don't have STEM workers, although that's not actually true. And so then they say, our education is just horrible. Look at these schools in Washington, D.C. or Newark, New Jersey. We'd love to hire these non-white people, but, these schools are terrible. So while we're fixing the schools, and they've been fixing the schools since the 1990s, over 20 years, we need to bring these people in as immigrants. And again, this distinction between these guest worker programs and immigration and, for example, refugees, the last couple of years, people fleeing, civil war or some horrible thing that's happening in their home country, is often blurred. So these folks are brought here under these visas where they're sort of locked into an employer, and these people, the reason they're supposedly being brought in is because of the STEM shortage. We just can't find qualified people. So you have three things. You have the STEM shortage claims, you have the education policy, and you have immigration, which have been intertwined and linked together, stapled together over and over again in public policy debates. And in addition, this is often tied in with racial issues and diversity issues about, typically, as I said, about so-called underrepresented minorities, which means really blacks or African Americans and Hispanics, and also women. And so a lot of what they're trying to say is kind of like, well, the reason for the one of the things involved in the STEM shortage is the poor education of these groups. That doesn't really explain women, for example, because women come from highly educated groups. You don't have this selectively poor white women from upper middle class or middle class families are just as well, in principle, educated as their brothers, who do get hired in higher proportions. But they tangle all of these issues up together. And this can make criticizing of these things or even trying to figure out what's going on very difficult. And many of these, one might think of them as red herrings or distractions, are intertwined in a discussion of these political matters. Now, one of the amazing things, particularly specifically about the STEM shortage claims, so the STEM shortage claims are really not true. Okay, they're factually untrue. But they're very, very widely repeated in the major media. There's very few critical articles ever produced. There have been a few over the years in major magazines or major newspapers. Media organizations have put out some critical articles. Recently, Michael Hiltzik at the Los Angeles Times put out an editorial. He's sort of an opinion editorial writer on science and technology that, this seems to be complete nonsense. Several years ago, Brian Vastag at the Washington Post did an article on the huge glut of Ph.D.s in biology that were being produced. So the Washington Post is a major, advertising-driven newspaper. But that's very unusual to see that. Most of the news articles, and especially the opinion pieces, editorials, and the editorial pages of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal are all promoting this. So there's this remarkable unanimity in the mass media about promoting these factually untrue claims. And it also, all of this sort of language or these politics are curious in that they really don't follow the left-right axis, the Republicans versus Democrats, the liberals versus conservatives. You find the same basic ideas, the same talking points repeated by, the Bush administration, the conservative Republicans, and the Obama administration. Barack Obama was taken to task at one point. They had this public relations activity where they had a Google Hangout, and this woman from Texas raised questions about the H-1B visa program, And Obama was embarrassed because he's like, well, all the people I know, all the CEOs that I know that are donating to my campaigns say there's a terrible shortage. He's saying, well, my Texas Instruments laid off my husband. He can't seem to find a job in Texas, which has all these high-tech employers in the Plano, Texas area. Somehow they don't want to touch him. What's going on here, right? And Obama was just like, oh, send me his resume. Well, but it's independent. I mean, the same kind of talking points surface regardless of whether you're dealing with Republicans or Democrats. And criticism also comes sort of scattered across the political spectrum. So the Economic Policy Institute, which is affiliated with the AFL-CIO, has put out white papers and other materials critical of the STEM shortage claims and some of the related policies. And you have sort of much more right-wing groups like Michelle Malkin, who used to be in Fox News or something like that, did a whole book about it and things like that. So you get criticism of it across the political spectrum, from the left, the right, the center. Some people, whatever their reason, they look into it, and one of the basic things is that they find that the STEM shortage claims are factually untrue. And there are also, questions about some of these other issues like education. The education, for example, is very contentious, where you have, the charter school movement and the teachers' unions and these other groups screaming at each other, it's all your fault, that kind of thing. And these things are tangled together in a very complicated way, which makes them difficult to pull apart and evaluate in a sort of rational, sensible way. Perhaps that's an intentional obfuscation by the people involved. So I say, well, what's the reason that you get this? Well, for example, with the Democrats, with Obama, Google and Facebook and Apple are all plugged in with Democrats, with Al Gore. Eric Schmidt was a major supporter, the Google CEO was a major supporter of Hillary Clinton. There's watchdog groups that have shown that there have been literally hundreds of people that have moved back and forth from jobs in the Obama White House and executive branch and Google. And so these companies, employers of STEM workers, and also universities do this, and research labs and government research labs, these entities, many of them are very plugged into the Democratic Party, and they're very plugged into the Republican Party. They donate lots of money to the Republicans. There are some differences in which companies support whom, but they have great influence across the political spectrum. They provide funding to supposedly independent non-government organizations. I think one of the founders of Facebook bought the New Republic, for example, which is a sort of liberal-leaning, intellectual magazine, sort of evolved into a website. So there's enormous influence going on. Jeff Bezos, of course, purchased the Washington Post and runs it. So whether you're talking about a liberal newspaper or a conservative newspaper or some alternative thing that's supposed to be far left or far right, frequently you find that these organizations have influence, and it's demonstrable when you see the extent to which these claims are so widely repeated, whether you're talking about supposedly liberal or democratic sources or conservative sources. And so there's a remarkable unanimity in the media among CEOs of STEM employers and other executives of STEM employers. Very few people ever buck the party line, even though it's factually untrue. I mean, there just isn't a shortage of STEM workers. So my conclusion, or what I'm trying to emphasize here, is that it's rather complicated, the politics of the STEM shortage claims. It's been linked very tightly to a number of other issues, and those issues include education, they include immigration policy, they include various kinds of, diversity, race relations, feminism. I mean, an astonishing range of, on the surface, unrelated or somewhat, I would say unrelated areas have been stapled together and connected and hinged actually on these claims, which are not true. So it's a very remarkable intertwining, and yet also this intertwining makes it difficult to rationally criticize the claims specifically, and more generally various policies, because you have to pull apart these things which are actually logically separate. So we could have great education and still have a shortage of STEM workers. We could have a shortage of STEM workers, but it's not really a good idea to bring in guest workers from, say, China or India to deal with that, right? I mean, that has issues with it. And in each of these areas, it's not uncommon to find this blurring of categories that makes it difficult to talk about the issues. So, for example, in immigration, you often see a blurring between guest worker programs, which actually theoretically are not immigration at all, immigration programs to bring people here and actually become U.S. citizens, and finally the issue of refugees from very civil wars and other severely negative situations in their home country that might force them to flee. Um, in general, these STEM worker employers aren't really that interested in refugees from Syria or Central America or whatever. They don't. That's not who they're actually hiring, but they've sort of intertwined these guest worker programs and systems with the issue of people who may have a fear for their life that they might actually be killed or something really horrible happen to them if they stay in their home country. These are not exactly the same thing. They certainly overlap. I mean, people who flee to Europe or flee to the United States from some kind of civil war or a situation like that, they can also become STEM workers or they can also become workers, but they're not exactly the same. They're definitely not the same situations. There's an overlap between them. And so what you see in this is a tangling up, an interconnection of several different public policy issues, political issues, with these remarkably untrue claims that there are shortages. And actually, we just don't have enough people. Companies are going to go out of business, all that kind of stuff. So there's a tangling. So I would basically urge people who encounter these issues not to take any of the things that are said entirely at face value, and certainly not the STEM shortage claims, and to drill down, to look into them carefully, and to look carefully at the way various terms are defined and used, because they're often blurry, misleading language, in order to understand these issues carefully, and also to really try to separate the issues out more, because they're often presented in a way that tangles them up together, to try to separate the issues out more carefully, to think about them more effectively, and actually safeguard your own interests. So one of the points here is that it seems to me very clearly there's an interest which is very simple. The STEM employers in the short term, they want cheap, compliant workers. Right? That's what they're looking for. So they promote various ideas that they think will get them cheap, compliant workers. Now, in principle, of course, the goal of the cheap, compliant workers is to make more money or to be more successful as a business. That doesn't always work that way, right? This obsession with cheap, compliant workers makes STEM careers actually very unappealing to people such as myself, for example, that are highly intelligent and so on. Or, in other words, the people that they will often say they want to get, right? We want the best and all that. Well, I think that's not really true. But the problem, of course, is if you want to cure cancer, or you want to develop the new energy source, or you want, the AI program that's going to solve humanity's woes, or the kinds of things they often invoke that they say they want to create, or be their products or whatever, those things require, they're challenging to do, and they don't necessarily, the way to do that is not necessarily to get a cheap, compliant worker. It's like if you have a brain tumor, right, that's going to kill you in your head, you're not looking for a cheap, compliant neurosurgeon. You're looking for a really good neurosurgeon, right? And if you read something on the web that tells you this is the way that you should, have your brain operated on, you can go to the cheap, compliant neurosurgeon and say, sure, I can do that. He kills you, right? You're not looking for that neurosurgeon. You're looking for the neurosurgeon that goes, I'm sorry, that's wrong, guy. I've been doing this for 20 years, and you're going to kill yourself if you have your brain operated on that way. I'm going to do it this way because I know what I'm doing, and you better listen to me because, I'm a neurosurgeon, right? I mean, that's the guy you want. That's the guy that's going to save your life, right? Now, not because he's arrogant, he may be, but you're looking for people who actually know what they're doing and are highly intelligent and independent and so on. So this hunt for the cheap, compliant drone is in conflict with creating really good products or scientific breakthroughs or many of the things that the CEOs, the power scientists, and people who promote these beliefs will invoke. They'll say, "Oh my God, we can't cure cancer without these submissive drones from India or China." Or whatever. They're looking for people who don't talk back, who tell them what they want to hear and how brilliant their ideas are, and work very long hours and cost the minimum wage or something like that. That's what they're looking for. And of course, in many fields like cancer research, of course, have totally failed with this approach. The computer industry has had some big successes. Of course, it's actually not as bad as cancer research. It's not as bad as academia, where the salaries and working conditions are so poor that very few people who actually understood what they were getting into would ever work under these conditions that were really good. But in the Silicon Valley, you still have salaries that are they're not as competitive as they sound, because the cost of living in the Silicon Valley is very high, so they don't go as far as you think. The jobs are very unstable. The working conditions are very chaotic and often demeaning. So there's a lot of negatives, despite what on the surface looks like a more desirable place to be, or a desirable job. So these companies and employers, whether they're academia, government, or industry, they are creating the sort of employment situation that is extremely unappealing to the kind of creative, independent, brilliant people they say they want, right? They're creating an environment, and it will ultimately be very unappealing to the top students from China or India that they're bringing in, because those people are going to say, well, why do I need to go to the U.S. and get treated like a doormat? I can stay in Shenzhen in China and make a startup and crush Apple, or I can go to Bangalore and create a startup and crush Apple or Google or these other companies, because they're being brought to the United States in many cases to be exploited, to be abused. And certainly if they don't get a green card and they go back, not probably happy campers, that may ultimately work out rather poorly for the Googles and the Apples and the Facebooks and so on. But even if they come to the U.S., the similar dynamics can occur even if they get a U.S. citizenship. So the overall system that's being promoted with this political morass of linking all these issues together isn't really all that great. It has really seriously negative consequences that are, they're actually visible in many research fields that aren't hot right now. Stagnation in aerospace and energy technologies and stuff is symptomatic of this. But it hasn't really crushed the computer industry yet, partly because the working conditions, although they're going downhill, are still better than like working as a graduate student or being involved in these, super bureaucratic, stifling, cancer research, for example, programs that never get anything produced. So anyway, that's my rant, and I hope, again, that you will understand that these are very complicated. They've pulled a lot of things together, linking these claims to a whole bunch of other things and issues. And you need to kind of pull them apart and think about them more systematically and separately to understand what's actually going on or what the issues are. If you like this, please click like and give me some comments, give me some feedback on what you like, what you don't like. This is the second video in a series that I'm doing on the STEM shortage claims. You could write a book. People have written books on the STEM shortage claims and related issues. So if you like it, please indicate so.